reports were filed by someone at the church for the years 87, 88, and 89. So it's a 3-year period after that before the state dissolves it, and then they've got 3 years after that. 3 of these years on which the Internal Revenue placed liens. So what the Internal Revenue was replacing liens on was a corporation still on active status, not an unincorporated lordship church at that point. One further thought. The church was represented by an attorney. An attorney is an officer of the court. An organization is an organization entering the court, being represented by an officer of the court, admits to the jurisdiction of the court. First of all, let me broaden my subject here. Lordship churches, A, do not use attorneys, and B, do not go to court. The reason why they do not do that is because they are not under the jurisdiction of the court, but the day the Lordship Church steps into a court and says, "Hi, here we are because you asked us to be here," they have admitted to the jurisdiction of the court. Secondly, when you hire an officer of the court to represent you in the court that you say doesn't have jurisdiction over you, and you hire an officer of the court to come and represent you in that court and say, "Hi, we're here to say you don't have any jurisdiction," the judge has to chuckle. Now let me see here. I asked you to come to court and you showed up. You hired one of our guys to come and represent you, and you're trying to tell me you don't belong here? Doesn't work. All right? So this concept of an attorney representing a lordship church in a situation where we're trying to say you don't have... Now, does that mean that we never use attorneys? No. Law Center has attorneys that we work with, but never in this in a situation like this. You cannot, when you're trying to represent the fact that the church is not under the jurisdiction of a court, you cannot go to that court and use an officer of that court to say, "Hi, you don't have jurisdiction." All right? So in my opinion, this is just my opinion, you understand, it's not even in our book, but it's my opinion, the case was lost here. We can look at these other things, and we listed 7 or 8 in our book, and you can look at the other things and say, well, yeah, I see where this happened and that happened, the other thing. In my opinion, the case is lost here. The Baptist Temple case is not a true or accurate example of what would happen if a church did not come under corporate status, because it was not incorporated. In other words, you can't say, okay, if my church is not incorporated, it's a lordship church and it's pure and so forth, this same thing will happen to it. No, because this is not an illustration of that kind of a case. This case is an example to all incorporated churches that they must agree to go by the corporate laws which they deliberately volunteer to put themselves under. In other words, if you're going to get out from under the corporate status, you have to follow the corporate law in order to get the sovereign will to excuse you and to disband your corporation so that you can become what you want to become. All right? So, again, it's not a matter of, this is a matter that mistakes were made, and those mistakes were costly, but we need to understand that this is not just the general case with every incorporated church. We have never, for instance, had a church in court. I take that back. We had a church in court because it was in court when they came to us. We've never taken a church to court. All right? We don't believe that churches belong in court. We had a church in Wisconsin who came to us and said, "Hi, you know, we need help because we're going to lose our property because we lost in the local court." And so we appealed to the appellate court of Wisconsin and said, "Hi, the local court made a mistake because they thought they had jurisdiction over this church and they don't." And the appellate court said, "You're right, they don't have jurisdiction over this court or over this church." By and large, we don't go to court because we deal with the issues. Now, as I stand here today, since 1987, we have never had an issue with a church that we could not resolve without the church compromising its stand. Okay, now tomorrow that may change. But as of today, the Lord has been awfully good to us, and we've been able to deal with every issue that we have faced, and been able to resolve the issue without ever having a church having to compromise its convictions. And so, but one of the problems we have is that we have a lot of people who have accused us of being soft because we don't stand on the front porch and shake our fist and, you know, threaten violence and that kind of stuff. We deal with county officials or attorney generals. I dealt with Skippy Humphrey, Hubert Humphrey's grandson, when he was the attorney general in Minnesota, and I talked to him about a situation up there. It was a property tax issue, and I explained to him our position. And when I got done, he said, "Let me ask you a couple of questions." I said, "Fine." He said, "Does the church own property in its own name?" I said, "No." He said, "Does the church have vehicles that are licensed to the church?" I said, "No." He said, "Does the church accept tax-deductible gifts?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, at least you're consistent. I understand your position," and that resolved the issue. He instructed the folks there that the church there was not taxable, not exempt. It wasn't taxable. So there is a difference in the way you deal with these things. Falwell versus Lynchburg in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The battle to give back ground already taken. Something we don't do real often. But fortunately, Jerry Falwell was a groundbreaker in this area. Since the days of Madison, it was impossible, illegal to incorporate a church in the state of Virginia. Could not be done. Basically because of Madison and his relationship with John Leland, some of the folks back there, it has never been possible to incorporate a church in the state of Virginia until 2003. So we had one state where not only was it okay to be unincorporated, you couldn't even be incorporated. By the way, just a passing thought. Just because a church does not have incorporation papers does not make them a lordship church. We have a lot of pastors around who have unincorporated their church. They got rid of their paperwork and all that kind of thing, and but they're still corporate churches here, and they're still unincorporated associations in the eyes of the state and still under their jurisdiction because they have not shed the mindset. That's the reason we try to emphasize the lordship mindset. What we need to do is get into the Word of God, as Brother Bob was doing this morning. We need to get into the Word of God and find out what a church is supposed to be, rather than just trying to determine what a church is not supposed to be, and we work from the negative side and never get to the positive side. The Falwell case challenged the constitutionality of several provisions in the Virginia Constitution and the Code of Virginia that impose unique limitations on churches, specifically Article 4, Section 14, number 20, which banned churches from incorporating. And in addition, Section 57, number 12 of the Code of Virginia, which limits the amount of real property a church may own to 50 acres within a city or town and 250 acres in any one county. So there were certain limitations that were put on churches as far as the ownership of property and as far as the fact that they were not allowed to incorporate. While the court noted that such provision preventing the incorporation of churches violated the U.S. Constitution and lacked facial neutrality, it did note that the likely explanation, this is interesting because the court said this, it noted that the likely explanation for the existence of Section 14 is that its drafters believed that state incorporation of individual churches was inconsistent with the principles of Mr. Jefferson's Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and that any infringement of religious freedom constituted an infringement of a natural right of mankind. The court said, although we understand the constitutional argument here,